and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture is now negative, or certainly at least skeptical towards Christianity. You know, even going back to the founding fathers, many of our leaders weren't especially devout people, let's just say, but they at least publicly held Christianity in honor. Now that's not necessarily the case anymore. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you land a job at Goldman Sachs or Google. Quite the opposite, in fact. Christian morality is now expressly repudiated and, in a sense, is now viewed as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And I think we can sense that in the term Christian nationalism, which maybe we'll talk more about. And the entry into this negative world has really caused quite a dislocation to evangelicals specifically, to others too, of course, and the effects are pervasive in society. But really, my book explains, and unpacks in more detail what happened over the last 60 years, how the evangelical church responded to that last 60 years of decline, the different strategies that were ongoing, so the dynamics of the evangelical church. And then about 3/4 of the book is about how we should live now in light of this negative world as evangelicals. And I talk about how to do that as individuals and families, as churches and institutions, and then in terms of missionality and engagement.
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
We have another fantastic episode for you guys today, a live episode that we're doing with an audience here of lovely, wonderful, beautiful faces. We have today Aaron Renn, a returning guest to the show. I believe he either holds the record or the runners-up for the previous longest episode ever of this podcast. We will be much more economical with time this time, not because we don't have a lot to talk about, we do, but because if you really want to dig into his thought, you should buy the book, which I highly encourage everyone do. The book is Life in the Negative World, and it is out now. Aaron, I feel like the best question and the least asked question for anyone who has a new book out is, what is your book about? It's the negative world.
Great question. This is actually the most popular and influential thing that I ever came up with in my life to date. And I came up with it in 2014. And then I originally published a version of it in my newsletter in 2017. It actually went viral then, and is the only reason I'm still writing a newsletter is because it went so viral. And then I republished it, an updated version in 2022 in First Things Magazine, which is probably the most talked about article in the history of First Things Magazine. It's called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. Then I turned it into a book, Life in the Negative World. So what is the negative world? America never had a state church like Europe, but for most of our history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So if you go back to the 1950s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. That was the high watermark of church attendance in America. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our monies, "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. There's an image that goes viral on social media periodically. It's the skyline of New York with the skyscrapers lit up in huge crosses in the window, when the lights in the windows for Easter. That picture was taken in 1956. And so we really were a very essentially Christian normative society at that time. And that old generic Protestant consensus started to become unraveled in the 1960s. Christianity started to go into decline in America. Decline in church attendance, decline in personal adherence, and decline in terms of the moral systems of Christianity beginning to get called into question. And I divide that period of decline from 1964 to the present, and it's still declining, alas, into three phases or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994, and this is a period of decline for Christianity. I want to make that clear. You know, the sexual revolution is happening, church attendance is declining, and yet Christianity was still basically viewed positively by society. To be known as a good church-going man They just seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society, and violating them could get you in trouble. Then in 1994, we hit a tipping point, and we enter what I call the neutral world, where Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian moral norms have a sort of residual effect. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture is now negative, or certainly at least skeptical towards Christianity. You know, even going back to the founding fathers, many of our leaders weren't especially devout people, let's just say, but they at least publicly held Christianity in honor. Now that's not necessarily the case anymore. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you land a job at Goldman Sachs or Google. Quite the opposite, in fact. Christian morality is now expressly repudiated and, in a sense, is now viewed as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And I think we can sense that in the term Christian nationalism, which maybe we'll talk more about. And the entry into this negative world has really caused quite a dislocation to evangelicals specifically, to others too, of course, and the effects are pervasive in society. But really, my book explains, and unpacks in more detail what happened over the last 60 years, how the evangelical church responded to that last 60 years of decline, the different strategies that were ongoing, so the dynamics of the evangelical church. And then about 3/4 of the book is about how we should live now in light of this negative world as evangelicals. And I talk about how to do that as individuals and families, as churches and institutions, and then in terms of missionality and engagement.
So I want to test sort of both sides of the thesis in this sense. 50% of U.S. adults being church attending is not the overwhelming, saturating supermajority that I think if you were to poll people on the street in terms of what they assume the status quo ante was, it would be. And then on the other side, if you go to a public event in American life today, maybe say a presidential debate on either side, there's still, I think, a positive disposition towards Christianity. Now, it's often used for all sorts of nefarious, goals. But, when Pete Buttigieg starts talking about how important his faith is to him on a Democratic presidential debate stage, it's still largely received positively. So one, was the positive world ever so positive? And two, is the negative world all that negative?
Certainly, it was positive in the sense that, again, official elite culture supported this, sort of generic Protestant establishment, if you will. For one thing, America at the time was literally run by a group of people they called the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And, in the 1950s, if you were Jewish or Catholic, you might not be invited into an august room like this. For example, famously, I think it was Barry Goldwater, who was half Jewish. I think he was raised Episcopalian, but half Jewish, was blackballed from a country club. And he said, since I'm only half Jewish, can I join if I only play 9 holes? I don't know if that's really true or not. But, so there really was almost, a de facto religious test to some extent. Now, of course, Protestants were a clear majority. There were obviously sizable Catholic and Jewish minorities in the country. But I think that shows something there. And again, that's why I also say, perhaps a better way to describe it is it's skeptically rather than negatively. You can identify as a Christian in America and not get into trouble. People are going to do a double take. They're going to want to say, well, what kind of Christian are you? To quote from a recent trailer. But basically, the contents of your religion cannot conflict with the secular narratives and new public morality in any way. So if you're Senator Raphael Warnock, who's he's a minister, he's fine. Pete Buttigieg, you're fine because they agree 100% with this sort of, secular morality, whereas our new Speaker of the House, he gets called a Christian nationalist and other bad names. And this is actually consequential because it allows people to retain a Christian identity as long as they bring their beliefs into conformity with sort of the secular positions. And so that is a form of subtle pressure, I think, that will be bearing down on everyone, that will cause them to be searching for ways to justify doing that.
So you talked about these tipping points in 1994 and 2014. What precipitated those tipping points that made us transition from one world to another?
Yeah, I'm not one of these where did it all go wrong kind of people. Some say, where did it go all? William of Ockham and nominalism, or it was the Enlightenment, things like that. I don't know what happened, but I will say there were a couple of milestones along the way. The one that I always like to point out, and this is a source of debate because you could have picked 1989, I think, as the start of the neutral world, because that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a critical event because communism was an explicitly atheist, materialist system. In fact, communism really persecuted religion, and Christianity was part of the West's moral war with the Soviets during the Cold War. There's a reason why we were adding "In God We Trust" to our money, "Under God to the Pledge" in the 1950s. What's going on in the 50s? The Cold War is going on in the 1950s. So as long as the Cold War is going on, we are not going to see Christianity, kind of jettisoned. But once the Cold War ended, that provided an opportunity to unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be, a Western liberal democratic society. And in fact, that's essentially what has happened, I think. So that's a really a key event.
So then did we go from one form of instrumentalized Christianity on behalf of the powers that be, in this case for the Cold War, to a different kind, which is, to be a heckin' good person, you have to be a liberal, as the meme goes. Yeah. Is anti-communist instrumentalized Christianity, part of the same through line as, Pete Buttigieg Christianity? I don't mean to keep bringing him up. It's just that he's such a great example of the kind of version of Christianity that is acceptable in the public square.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a sort of I don't think we really do have an instrumentalized Christianity in that way. I think our elites don't appeal to a Christian narrative to morally legitimate their system anymore. I think that's part of what it means to be in this new era. Even in the old days, people would appeal to these narratives, Christian narratives and understandings of society, to legitimate their positions. You just really don't hear that as much. There used to be much more of a Christian left, I think, than there is today. And so, Pete Buttigieg is maybe something of a throwback in that regard. I think another key moment, though, was, if you call it a key moment, it was really President Obama's second term. And, after he was reelected, there really was like a big shift. Maybe he did succeed at some level in fundamentally transforming America because what happened during his second term? One, we had the Great Awakening as Matthew Iglesias. He's a leftist guy. He said that was 2014. And even if you pull it back a little bit earlier to Trayvon Martin, that was 2012. Getting really into there, getting close to that. Jonathan Haidt said 2013 is when things started to go crazy on college campuses. 2015 was the Obergefell ruling legalizing gay marriage. And of course, 2016 was Trump and the craziness there. And so something really did go crazy kind of a little bit in America during Obama's second term, and it really hasn't calmed down since.
So one of the distinctions you make in the book is the difference between, the mainline denominations and evangelicals more broadly. What, for people in the audience who might not know, we have some Catholics in the room, so just being able to elucidate that, the differences between the two and how they've diverged so widely on their politics.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There really wasn't. There's a lot of ways to define what an evangelical is. In fact, it's sort of like the old "what is jazz" question. There's so many different ways. It's difficult. But the way that I define an evangelical is the way that they use in social science surveys. So there's this when they call you up on the phone to do a poll and they ask you, your religious background. The way they code that uses a system. It's called RELTRAD, which I think stands for religious tradition. And it's not based on anything about what you believe. It's basically based on the kind of or denomination of the church you attend. And they divide, religions into these standard elements. And if you're a Protestant American, then there are basically three choices. You are either mainline, you're from the Black Protestant tradition, or you are an evangelical. And again, it's based on the kind of churches that you attend. So if you're Black and you attend, say, a Southern Baptist church, you're going to be coded as evangelical because it's going to be based on the church that you attend. And so that's really it. And I define it sort of sociologically. I do think if you go back into history, there were sort of evangelicalism wasn't as divided as sharply from the mainlines. There was a lot of movement back and forth. In fact, a lot of the leading quote unquote evangelicals were in mainline denominations like the PCUSA, and people moved back and forth, and they actually believed a lot of the same things. The truth is, the mainline denominations and the evangelicals basically had the same view of morality and ethics up until probably getting into the 1970s is when that started to diverge. Don't quote me on the exact date on that. And so, liberal Protestants may not have believed in the virgin birth or the resurrection of Christ or anything of that, but they sort of, believed adultery was a sin and all the other same stuff. And there was a lot of moving back and forth. Now, those mainline denominations, sort of as they declined, they sort of got crazier and crazier and basically morphed into being essentially an appendage of, sort of whatever is, going on in the culture at the moment, if you will. So I don't know what all drove it, but for a long time, there really wasn't a huge distinction in terms of some of these boundaries. You could be an evangelical and be in a mainline denomination. You would have been evangelical if you believed in things like the divinity of Christ, for example.
So you must have a heck of an agent, because I've never seen a book get a Super Bowl ad before, but you functionally did with this "He Gets Us" ad that happened during the Super Bowl. One, explain it to the audience in case they've forgotten or didn't see it at the time, and test it against the thesis of this book, why it isn't up to snuff according to your perspective.
Sure. So probably a couple years ago, this group of people, big time donors came together to create an ad campaign for Jesus. It's called "He Gets Us." And it was originally $100 million, but apparently they liked the results so much they decided to spend upwards of $1 billion on this. And there were ads. They actually ran ads in the 2023 Super Bowl, and then they ran them again this year. And now last year when they ran in the Super Bowl, they were very controversial then. And I actually somewhat defended the idea of a campaign called "He Gets Us," because if you think back to, say, the era of the Billy Graham crusade, people who came to hear Billy Graham, speak, he didn't need to tell them who Jesus was. Most people knew who Jesus was. They knew the basics of the Bible stories. They may not have been able to give you a theologically correct, view of the gospel or something, but, they knew all the Bible stories. They knew who Jesus was. They probably had a vague sense that there was a God and that he wasn't happy with people who did bad things, and they probably should be going to church and should be a better person. And so he's able to tap into all of that latent knowledge and simply preach the theology of the gospel, the message of the gospel that people could then respond to and resonate with. And so that was like in the positive world. In these previous eras, cultural Christianity, if you want to call it that, basically gave people all the knowledge that they needed to at least understand Christianity and respond to it. Another example I give, although it's from further back, is the James Baldwin novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is a great book, highly recommended. It doesn't make any sense at all if you don't know anything about Christianity. It just assumes people understand the themes, the religious themes that are being talked about in the book. Fast forward to 2023, most younger people, literally, they've heard of Jesus Christ, obviously, but they really can't tell you much at all about Christianity. They don't know the Bible stories. They weren't raised in Sunday school. They have to be given some basics. some reason to care. First, why would I even care to know anything about this Jesus guy? And then secondly, maybe tell me about him. So I kind of like the he gets us idea of being what I call pre-evangelistic. It's trying to tell people, oh, Jesus is related, can relate to our condition, which is a true statement. And it says in the Bible, he had to be made in all ways like unto his brothers. He was like us. He does get us. I think that's a proper biblical theme. It would also stress, his concerns, etc. So I actually mentioned that in the book, and I was feeling pretty good about it. And then I saw the 2024 Super Bowl ads, and I'm like, this is terrible. And I think they actually switched management teams on the ad campaign. The new guy who's running it, who's like some kind of a pizza marketer, literally, there's an ad, that was how he was described in the Wall Street Journal in some interview with him. And it became much less about telling us about Jesus and much more about criticizing conservative evangelicals. And so we could get into that, but that's an example, I think, of how this one tribe of evangelicals maybe represented. I call them cultural engagers, although they're not all cultural engagers. It's sort of a hybrid of the sort of urban Christians that I label cultural engagers and others who basically had a allergic reaction to Donald Trump. They're now spending all their time and energy in a culture war against other evangelicals. And so unfortunately, he gets us morphed into that. But I think part of that gets to, if you're somebody who's trying to talk to somebody about share your faith with them, you can't presume that they have any common understanding of the stuff that maybe you did when you were growing up.
So getting into some of the solutions that you've outlined in the book, can you break down a little bit for us this idea of cultural engagers, culture warriors, etc.?
Sure. I don't know if this is really the solution, but this is sort of what happened over the last 60 years. I said there were basically three sort of strategies that evangelicals developed for changing times, two from the positive world and one from the neutral world. In the positive world, those were culture war and seeker sensitivity. In the neutral world is what I call cultural engagement. So the culture war is the religious right that we all know. People like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, starting in the 1970s, as part of the broader New Right movement of that era, really decided they saw all the stuff happening in the culture they didn't like, and they're like, here's how we're going to respond. We're going to mobilize politically to fight back, take back the culture. And I think the very name of Falwell's organization, Moral Majority, speaks to a positive world when it was at least plausible to claim. Maybe it wasn't even true then, but it was at least plausible to claim that Christians represented the majority of the country. Nobody would ever make such a claim today. And of course, the religious right is still with us. And part of this development of the culture war strategy, by the way, involved a realignment of evangelicals from the Democrat to the Republican Party. Some people don't realize that they used to call the Episcopal Church the Republican Party at prayer, and that evangelicals were originally Democrats. In fact,
someone tell the Rainbow Flag Church block here.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter was America's first evangelical president. 1976 was Newsweek's Year of the Evangelical, largely because of him. And there were a lot of people worried about what it meant for a Bible thumper like Carter to get into the White House. The second strain is what I called seeker sensitivity, which was pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, or Rick Warren of Saddleback Church in Orange County. This also got going in the 70s. And what these people did was they saw that Christianity was in decline, and they're like, well, why don't we design a church people actually want to attend? And so the origin story of Willow Creek is that Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago asking people, why don't you go to church? Another sort of positive world thing to do. He's like, oh, would you do that today? Probably not. And as he said, I got an earful. And so you're like, I'm going to design a church they'll go to. We're going to get rid of these denominational distinctives, stodgy hymns and choir robes and organ music. We're going to have contemporary music. It's going to be more informal. It's going to have topical therapeutic sermons. And this sort of, as it's evolved, has become essentially the non-denominational suburban megachurch that we all know. And is in many ways, this is the evangelical mainstream. Then in the neutral world of the 1990s, we saw a third strand emerge, which I call cultural engagement, which really came up with the resurgence of the cities under people like Rudy Giuliani in New York. I think there's a couple ways to think about cultural engagement. One is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. Just as Hybels and Warren reached suburbanites, the emerging baby boomer suburbanites, people like Tim Keller in New York City at Redeemer Presbyterian Church reach these people who are coming back into the cities. A second way to think about it is as the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, which isn't very fun for most people, like, why don't we sit down and talk to people? And so they said, let's take advantage of this pluralistic public square to have a conversation because we believe we can articulate the gospel in a compelling way to them. And so these were the strategies, and these are all still with us. You can sort of think of them as rural, suburban, and urban evangelicalism in a lot of ways. That's an oversimplification, but sort of gives a little bit of their dispositions. As we've entered the negative world, though, there really hasn't been the development of a negative world strategy. The one guy who came up with something for the negative world really was Rod Dreher with his Benedict option. And you may recall at the time, the Benedict option got kind of dumped on. My understanding is Pope Francis doesn't like it. The Evangelicals didn't like it. Christianity Today magazine commissioned 4 people to give their opinions on it, and all 4 of them had significant concerns and problems with the book. I understand Benedict option's making something of a comeback these days as people look for something. But instead, I think what we saw in the evangelical world is as the pressures of the negative world started to bear down on the church, we've seen a few things. One, we've seen deconstruction. I think the deconstruction movement cannot be understood apart from the negative world. There are big incentive structures in our society to deconstruct and get out of this place, basically. Second one is realignment. So take a guy like David French. 10 years ago, you would have said David French was a hardcore culture warrior. Today, he's a New York Times columnist. Quite a shift, to say the least, in Mr. French. And there's been many others that have moved around in various directions. And then we've seen a sort of doubling down and deformation on the old strategies. So, as I said, the culture war people have decided to become extremely, they've tried to become much more synchronized with the culture. Rather than engaging, they want to be as in sync as possible because that's the incentive. And so they talk a lot about what I call refugees and racism. That's what they really want to talk about. That's what they really want to be, going crazy about. All the stuff they can talk about that the left's going to like them for. And what are they not? They want to talk less about other things that might get them in trouble. And they really, really, really want to go after anybody who supports Donald Trump as being a horrible, evil person, denouncing Christian nationalism. Tim Alberta of The Atlantic is the perfect example of this way of thinking about the world in his new book. And so there's that. And then, of course, I think at the culture warriors, let's be honest, the culture warriors have also deformed. The culture warriors, I think, were the people who would have been most likely to say character is paramount in political leaders like president, as they would have gone after Bill Clinton over Lewinsky, et cetera. Well, now this group of people, I think, really have adopted a more Machiavellian approach to politics. It's like, well, we can't let Hillary win. We got to vote Trump. And so I think, their views is now we're gonna take the gloves off. We're gonna be as mean and nasty as the other guys, basically. And so I think what's happened is this group of people in the cultural engagers are now sort of going at it. And this has been a source of intra-evangelical conflict, to say the least.
One of the classic refrains from people that would criticize the oeuvre that you're a part of is that actually Christian engagement in the world is at its most natural and at home when it's in a negative world. That actually the anachronism was the positive world, and really it's good for Christians to be in the negative world. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, that's Russell Moore, who's the editor of Christianity Today and formerly a hotshot in the Southern Baptist Convention. He's sort of been very critical of that and critical of what he calls cultural Christianity. He thinks it makes people hypocrites and things of that nature. It certainly did make some hypocrites, but again, it makes it easy to share the gospel too. And is it a good thing or a bad thing if there are, fewer Christians in the world? I think that's a bad thing. And so I don't think it's good. I think it's also naive to suggest that persecution always strengthens the church. Empirically, Christianity has gone extinct or been dramatically reduced in many places due to sort of persecution and other things happening. And then also, and there's a lot of variations on the way people talk about this too. Like, we lose down here is like a line you hear them talk a lot. And I can't help but notice that the people who say that all seem to be winning in life. Russell Moore is doing quite well for himself as the head of the Atlantic. He's getting speaking engagements all over the country. He's being feted in the Atlantic and all these other places. He's, on Meet the Press. And so it's like life actually seems to be treating him pretty well. And so certainly from the perspective of the world, he's, maybe more liked than he's ever been back, when people would have just thought he was just another fundamentalist preacher.
So on building a strategy for the negative world, I'm going to ask the theological question: how then should we live?
Well, I always make clear in the book, and this is important, that I am not a pastor or a theologian. So I'm not giving people a lot of theological advice. I leave that to others. I'm a cultural critic and journalist. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is the context of what's going on in the world and the context in which people can live. And so I give, I come from a management consulting background. So I sort of give that perspective and some starter ideas. It's not, here's the church in a box toolkit for the negative
PowerPoint
world.
version of this book.
It's not. There was a PowerPoint version of my model that you could have gotten if you'd pre-ordered, Saurabh. But yeah. So so there's a bunch of ideas in here. But I'm gonna hit three themes. I'll hit three themes that I think are big ones that we should consider. One is to adopt a posture of exploration. And again, if you go back to Hybels and Willow Creek, what did he do? He went around, he did market research. He, knocked on doors, and then he said, oh, how are the incumbent churches not serving the market needs? And they designed church. It's a business plan approach. Whereas I think today we're much more in like startup type territory. It's more unknown, more uncertain. It's more like Lewis and Clark setting off to explore, the Louisiana Purchase. And so we have to be comfortable operating in the unknown or walking by faith more than by sight than we have, because we're not going to know all the answers and we're not going to be able to devise a plan in advance. We're going to have to pivot. We're going to have to adapt, etc. The example I use from the Bible is the Israelites crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. This was a generation that had only known the wilderness, and the wilderness probably wasn't that great, and yet it was familiar. They knew it, and manna showed up every morning. Now they're going into the land of Canaan. They've never been there, but they know it's full of people who are not going to give it up without a fight. And so they're entering this unknown territory. And there's a line in the book of Joshua when they're crossing the river where it says, follow the ark because you have not been this way before. So in other words, keep your eye on, God's presence, keep your eye on God as you go into this unknown territory. I think that's important. A second one is to rebalance away from relevance and transformation to being a counterculture. So what do I mean by that? Tim Keller wrote a book called Center Church. It's his church planning manual. I actually think it's his best book. And he lists basically 4 styles of doing church, which he labeled relevance, transformation, counterculture, and 2 kingdoms. Relevance is what it sounds like. It's like trying to see what's going on out in the world, treating that as a sort of sign of what God's up to, and sort of, joining in with that a little bit. He classified the main lines as relevance, and he also classified the secret sensitivity as relevance, which I think goes along with their style. He didn't directly talk about cultural engagement. That is to say, he didn't put himself on the map. But I would classify cultural engagement as also primarily a strategy of relevance, although often with transformationalist aspirations. Transformationalist is the idea that the church is sort of extending the kingdom of God out into the world, transforming the world as the gospel advances. And he would have put the culture war religious right in this camp because they want to use politics to bring the world's order in line with the order of the church. Counterculture would be an example of counterculture would be sects like the Amish or other sort of different groups. Anabaptists, they emphasize the church as a distinct community, being in exiles, things of that nature. And, two kingdoms I won't talk about. It's more like the Lutherans. There's kind of a different model there. But the point is, evangelicalism has been heavily focused on relevance and transformation and not as much on counterculture. And so I'm not suggesting becoming like the Amish or like in a monastery or something like that. But I do think we need to balance away a little bit less on relevance and transformation, more emphasis on being a counterculture. That is, stewarding the strength, health of our own communities as religious minorities have always had to do. And, when you're a majority, you rely on the mainstream institutions of society to sort of reinforce your values and identity. When you're a minority, you can't do that. And so we need to learn from other religious minorities and create our own institutional life and practices. And the example I use is early 20th century Catholicism, where we had essentially an anti-Catholic country, let's be honest. And Catholics there said, hey, if we want to remain faithful Catholics in this Protestant country, we better create our own Catholic schools, create our own Catholic universities, create our own Catholic fraternal societies, on down the line. And they held on to those even as they were admitted to mainstream society, which is one reason Catholics have been stronger, for example, in the intellectual life and things of that nature. So I think being that sort of counterculture is important. And then lastly is what I call stay prudentially engaged. I think we have to take stock of the fact that if you're a culture warrior, the reality is social conservative agenda is not popular in America. That's reality. A majority of people want abortion to be legal. Yeah, it's a reality. So you have to think about what does it mean to do there. On the other hand, you don't want to just say, I'm going to go hide in a hole. You have to be engaged in the world at some point. And I think the cultural engagers have sort of been the just sit there and take a beating approach, which I don't think is right either. So we need to stay engaged, but we also need to be wise and realize, what's the art of the possible?
Be thinking of questions, because this is my final one. I think a useful example to maybe tie together these concepts that you've elucidated would be to take one of the remaining institutions in American life, other than the churches themselves, that Christians still own, and that's the Christian colleges. What's the approach that it seems like most Christian colleges are taking right now? And under the framework that you've established in this book, how would they go about adapting themselves to the negative world?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of them are yet to be transformed for the negative world or for the demographic shocks of the coming, enrollment declines. As we know, there's been birth rate declines, et cetera. So there's going to be fewer people who are going to be going to college, all of that stuff. There are, financial issues, et cetera. And I think most of them are not there yet. The college that's there is Hillsdale. Let's be honest. Hillsdale is killing it right now.
A lot of evangelicals get mad when you call Hillsdale a Christian college.
Well, I'm not calling. I do think, isn't it true? It's true. And I always point out, rather than getting mad at Hillsdale and saying they're not a Christian college, why don't you do something yourself? Why don't you create the distinctively Christian version of Hillsdale? And that was my point. They haven't done that. Even places like Grove City College, which was the model for Hillsdale in not taking federal funds, they haven't done it yet. And so I think this idea of articulating a compelling and distinct vision of who you are and holding to it, regardless of the pressures of the culture, people are drawn to that. And that's why Hillsdale is thriving. They're like, here's who we are. Here's what we stand for. And we also provide a pretty darn good education, by the way. And, the results speak for themselves. I don't suggest trying to create clone Hillsdale. That's not what I'm saying. Is to think about, what is your compelling vision? What are your values? What do you stand for? Probably some of them overlap with Hillsdale. Probably some of them are distinct from Hillsdale. And then say, okay, great. How do we then make our institution really be completely aligned with that vision and hold to it?
I did see some of the Grove City grads in the room nodding their heads when you said that. So it was very, very good. We're going to go now to questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. Don't be shy. I will bring you a mic.
Thank you very much for taking my question, and thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it very much. With that said, what role do you think class plays in regards to this? Specifically, the elites of the United States, in many ways, are kind of the philosophical and institutional descendants of the New England Puritans, whereas many evangelicals are sort of the not to paint too broad of a brush, are basically kind of the Anglicans of the South, or like Scotch-Irish Highlanders, if you will, kind of seen like that culturally. So what role do you think class plays in this antagonism towards Christianity?
I think class is very important, but class doesn't work necessarily as much in religion as we think. First off, in America, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to go to church. People think, religion is for the rubes. In fact, let's go on.
You can take Saurabh's.
In fact, religion is for the people who are by and large successful. Secondly, even much of what you call liberal Christianity is actually Republican. Other than the Episcopal Church, like even the PCUSA Presbyterian Church, which you think is very liberal, a majority of their members are Republicans. And even about a third of the Episcopal Church members are Republicans. I do think there is a class element, though, in that evangelical is heavily shaped by a middle-class mindset. And therefore, it does not understand institutional cultural power or how to lead, which is one reason that, like, even organizations with a lot of evangelicals, in them, like conservatives, a lot of evangelical conservatives. Evangelicals are basically the bedrock of the Republican voting base, yet relatively few evangelicals hold important top leadership positions in Conservatism Inc. And yes, Conservatism Inc. has always had a Catholic kind of normativity to it. At the same time, I think the evangelicals have not been really equipped to lead. And so I do think there is something of that. Why were the Catholics more intellectuals? Because the mainline denominations kind of, went in a different direction, and that's where the intellectuals of Protestantism were. So I think there's a class dimension of it, but it's not so religious. Where you end up with the real issue or real class divide, I think, is the real divide is between quote unquote evangelicals who actually go to church and ones who don't go to church. Because the ones who go to church tend to be, again, more educated. The ones who don't go to church tend to be less educated, and the ones who don't go to church are actually the biggest supporters of Donald Trump.
Aaron, you built your readership writing about men's issues in America. Is there a parallel between the transformations of sexual relations, men and women in America, and your Three Worlds thesis? To what degree do the changes that you documented under the masculinist parallel some of the positive, neutral, and negative worlds?
Yeah, so here's my hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that changing men's views of themselves as men is essentially the master switch that changes everything else and how they engage with the world. And I think that's fundamental. And so that's one reason I wanted to engage on that issue. And it's also one where I thought the evangelical church was just flat out wrong on a whole lot of points. And so I'm like, here's one area where I know they're wrong. And the first problem I say is always take the log out of your own eye. I think the evangelical church, and there's a whole chapter in the book on this, and I actually talk about gender in the book. It's the longest chapter, actually. It's the one on gender. Because I'm like, there's things that we've gotten wrong that we just need to take care of our own business, which we have not done in a whole host of domains. I think that is one, and I think that is key, because if we want to have strong church, we simply can't be conformed to the world in terms of our practices around family formation and all this other stuff. And so I definitely think getting squared away on gender is of critical importance, although I don't know precisely how it overlaps with the negative world per se.
So you talked about the diversity within the evangelical church, and you also gave kind of a vision and some steps that we could take to strengthen our communities. What do you think it's going to take for the evangelical church to unify even enough to take some of those steps? And are we going to just have to go further into this negative world till we get to that point?
I don't see unification happening. In fact, I see more fragmentation happening. Fragmentation not being a bad thing in the exploration space. Having lots of people trying different things until we figure out what works is actually a good thing. So I think we need to try lots of things, and as we get some feedback, we'll narrow it in on what works. But I do think, again, we're seeing less traditional sort of denominations and things like that. People are more realigning around loose networks and affiliations. So I think we are in a sort of fragmenting age. You know, just in general, trust in institutions are in decline. People are checking out of institutions. And so I think that trend is affecting evangelicalism as well. I expect continued fragmentation.
Thank you. Oh, Mr. Renn, my question is more about the negative world per se, because like you said, people don't even know what it means to be Christian anymore, unlike the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But now it's gotten to the point where people don't even know what being a man and a woman is anymore. It's gotten so bad that I'm wondering, should we even start with he gets us with the Jesus and Christian message, or should we go even more fundamental and just talk about what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Talk about things that are even more fundamental to how to live one's life, and then once people are healthy, men and women, then move into the Christian aspects.
I think some of that is part of it. I think that's a big part of how we do mission. I got interested in the topic again back in 2013. Because I saw young men turning to online influencers, but they weren't turning to the church. And this was before anybody had heard of Jordan Peterson even. But I think the Jordan Peterson phenomenon shows, especially in his original incarnation, shows that people are out there, they actually are hungry for someone who will give them some really kind of basic and banal truths in the right package. Because, he kind of got famous for saying like some pretty banal stuff like, I'm not going to comply with this Canadian pronoun law, or going on UK's Channel 4 and saying, actually there are differences between men and women on these psychological traits like agreeableness, and women on average are more agreeable and women are less agreeable. This has certain implications in the world. There's no reason we couldn't have said that stuff. Now, obviously, we may not have his personal charisma and style and any other things, but ultimately, there's a ton of people out there attracting gigantic followings, just providing very basic stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely like a lead magnet, if you want to call it that.
Thank you. Great discussion. Question, since so many folks here work on or near the Hill, what do you think are the implications of the negative world thesis on the decision folks make here as policymakers? I'm specifically interested, given my work, in how it should inform those who are involved in the discussions of the old right, quote unquote, and the new right on political economy and social policy.
Yeah, I don't know how much overlap there's going to be on like some of the economic issues. I don't know if there's a direct, evangelical per se or Christian position on them. I do think what it shows is I think we've seen the consensus is very much not aligned with the social conservative position. Because Congress already had a bipartisan vote to codify gay marriage, for example. Who knows if something similar will happen now on IVF and things of that nature. So I have to say, I think pushing a social conservative agenda is frankly a loser. And that's not to say some people who believe in those causes shouldn't continue to pursue them, but I do think you got to recognize that, like, even among Republican voters, most of these positions are not popular.
We're going to have time for one more.
I would love to just kind of know your thoughts on what you think the roles of Christian families are in this day and age. I kind of see two things of like, there's the Benedict option, homeschooling your kids, being in community with like-minded people, and then also like Katie Faust's books, How to Raise Kids in a Woke City. She lives in Seattle. Her kids go to public school. So it's two opposite sides of the coin, and I'd love to just know your thoughts on where that lies.
Well, I don't have any thoughts per se about how exactly to live as a family. I think people are going to come to different conclusions, but I do think you have to be intentional about your decisions in a way you didn't have to be in the past. Where you should live, where your kids get educated, what your profession should be, how much debt or spending you should take on, all of those things. But I will say, family is going to continue to be the bedrock of, human society. And to the extent that it's not, our society is not going to be healthy. And so we're not going to have healthy churches if marriage and children are not the normative path. And right now there's a huge push in the church to essentially decenter that and talk about the idolatry of the family and the gift of singleness. And I write in the book pretty forcefully that we need to reject that. Clearly, there are going to be more single people, many of them through no fault of their own, and they need to be welcomed and included, for sure. But we have to work hard to help people get married and find a path, give them information, they can use to create an environment in which we are living differently. To be a counterculture means we're not going to be like, the rest of the world where people are abandoning marriage and abandoning having kids. So I think if we have that, having those healthy families will actually be itself another draw to people as well.
I have a final question that I'll ask through executive privilege here. A concept that is not original to me by any stretch, but I think is a provocative point to bring up in these conversations is, are we trending towards a dynamic when it comes to how Christians engage in American public life that could be akin to a version of identity politics as it plays out in the left? Like, is the advice that you might be giving to American Christians not that dissimilar from the advice that, say, a Malcolm X, or take a less controversial figure, gave to Black Americans in previous decades?
I think, having a sense of distinctive identity is in fact very important. I think that is going to be, more important than it was in the past, and having a culture that's distinct. Now, I will say that does not necessarily mean that you have to engage in identity politics as understood. The Amish have an identity, but they do not have identity politics. And so I think having, strong, distinct communities, as, others do, is inevitable when you are a minority. And if you don't have that, you will soon cease to exist.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. The book is Life in a Negative World. It can be bought wherever books can be bought, which is many places. Maybe pick somewhere other than Amazon to buy them. Thank you, everyone, for listening. For the people who are tuning in online, please rate and review the podcast, subscribe on YouTube, and go to AmericanMoment.org. But that closes out this episode of Moment of Truth. We'll see you guys next week. If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.